Alright, so in this video we're going to be talking about the new Behringer UBXa synthesizer. I'm going to be mostly focusing in on the vintage mode of this synthesizer, or what Behringer calls their Atrophy settings. But first I'll just give you some first impressions. I've had the synth now for about 2 weeks, and I'll say the hardware quality, first of all, is pretty good. It is a nice sturdy metal enclosure. The knobs and buttons all feel fairly sturdy. Maybe not as high quality as like on the Oberheim OBX8, but they definitely feel good overall. There's not a lot of play in them, just a little bit. I do agree with others who have mentioned the screen positioning and the way they've done the backlight is not great. Here, if I'm just sitting at my desk at a normal position in the middle of the keybed, I can't read the LED display at all like this because it has this bright backlight and just the position of it. If I was centered over the screen, I could barely make it out from a standard position if I'm sitting over here, but you really have to lean in to see the screen if you're playing in a sitting position in front of it. So it's not a huge deal since most of the functions are a knob per function on the interface, but definitely when you get into like programming the mod matrix or getting into the atrophy settings or some of the more advanced functions, you do have to sort of lean in when you want to see the screen. So regarding the performance controls, you've got over here the mod and pitch paddles. These paddles are smaller than the ones on the Oberheim OBX8, and they have more resistance to them. So it's a little bit harder to do fine nuanced movements with the mod and pitch wheels, but they're not too bad, and they feel pretty sturdy overall. So for the Poly Aftertouch keybed, my first impressions on that is that it has a very light synth action feel to the keybed. I'm just very used to the Fatar TP9S and TP8 keybeds that are used in many synths from other manufacturers. This definitely has a super light feel to it, so that's something that I'll need to get used to. Barely takes any velocity to hit the key fully down, so it just has a different playing feel to it. But in regards to how the Poly Aftertouch action feels, I think that's well done on this. You can play and do full velocity hits and play leads on this without activating the Poly Aftertouch by accident. So you have to sort of hit the key at full velocity and then really push into the keys to get into the Poly Aftertouch. So yeah, my general thoughts on the keybed are definitely light on the synth action touch, but overall it's a good keybed. Okay, so now getting into the sound engine and the overall capabilities of the synth. My initial impressions on the sound engine are definitely sounds like an OBXa. Of course, it's got the CEM style oscillators and filter, the 3340 and 3320 style filters and oscillator by Cool Audio, which is Music Tribe's IC and chip factory. They make the clones of a bunch of different classic filter and oscillator chips. So yeah, you're definitely going to be able to get all those core sort of Oberheim OBXa type sounds out of this synth. So there are a couple of quirks with the sound engine on this synth that I want to mention though, and hopefully they'll be able to fix some of this in firmware updates. There is a prominent sort of popping sound that you sometimes get with the synth, especially in unison mode. Let me see if I can demonstrate this here. So as you can hear there in unison mode, when you're playing non-legato, it's especially evident there. You hear these popping noises. And even if you dial up the attack on the VCA envelope, it still exists. So that's one thing that I have noticed that's a little annoying, definitely when you're playing unison patches, and you can sometimes hear it in poly patches as well. One more thing I've noticed in regards to the general sound engine, the resonance control. I found that when I'm trying to dial in more squelchy resonant type of sounds with either the 2-pole or the 4-pole filter and get up there near the self-oscillating mode, but not quite self-oscillating, like right under there, where you get that nice squelchy sweeping sound. I found it's pretty hard to dial in, and I'm often like tweaking the resonance control just by the very slightest movement, where I'm literally just moving back and forth like one digit of change for the resonance, and feeling like I'd like more resolution in there, like I'd want to get it in between there sort of. And I don't know if that's something to do with just how they're translating the voltage of the potentiometer for the resonance control here to the actual resonance control on the filter circuitry. Also, regarding the filters, it would have been nice, of course, if they had just integrated the SEM two-pole filter that the OBX had in this synth as well, like what Oberheim did with their OBX8. That filter is generally thought of as the more desirable two-pole filter from Oberheim's history, and it's definitely the one I use more often on my OBX8. So yeah, it would have been nice if they just integrated this. I know they have plans to create a separate synth that's the UBX synth that's going to be mostly the same as this synth, but with slightly different filter section and oscillator discrete circuitry. But yeah, I just feel like it would have been nice if they went ahead and followed Oberheim's lead and just built one synth with both those options. But for the price, this is a great value for getting the classic UBXa sounds. And with the mod matrix too, that's another feature that's nice to have here. You've got 16 voices also, which is nice. The extension of voices for stacks. And then the mod matrix is helpful for doing some more advanced sound designs. So they have elevated the synth a little bit. It does feel like they should have also added effects within the synth engine if they're sort of going for taking the classic design but elevating it with mod matrix and additional voices. It would have been nice to go ahead and have some of their effects, because actually Behringer has done a great job, like on the DeepMind. The effects engine on that synth is excellent. And it would have just been nice to have that built in here so you can build full sound designs with integrated effects and also map modulations to the effects. Even though I often use outboard reverb or other effects in addition, I do like to have effects on the synth to be able to design sounds with them. But again, for the price point, this is a pretty good value for the synth for just what it has here. All right, so let's talk about the vintage mode or atrophy settings for the DeepMind. Atrophy is what Behringer calls their vintage modeling algorithm. This is one of the sort of headline features of the synth. If you read all their marketing materials, is they have 8 different vintage modes or 8 different atrophy profiles in here. And this is a topic that I've done a lot of research on personally. About 5 years ago, I set out and recorded tons of old vintage synths, classic Jupiters, memory Moogs, OBXs, OBXAs, CS80s, Poly 6s, and various other vintage and modern synths as well. And my goal was to try to understand what gives all these classic vintage synths the great character that they have. And the findings that I made were basically just that per voice variances lead to a huge portion of that sort of vintage classic character that everyone lusts for. So every oscillator on every voice is going to have unique offsets to its nominal tuning. The filter frequency and resonance varies per voice, and the attack, decay, and release of the envelopes and the timing of the LFOs varies from voice to voice in all these classic synths. And I wrote up this website at voicecomponentmodeling.com, which outlines my findings and gives an overview of how this type of vintage voice performance can be achieved in modern synths, either with existing built-in functions like mod matrix and gated sequencers, or through designing it directly into synth engines. So soon after I published this site, Sequential released the Prophet 5, Rev 4, and Prophet 10, which featured their new vintage knob. And the vintage knob uses this exact same sort of methodology that I've been advocating for, using tables of stable curated offsets to various aspects of the synth engine. About a year after that, I was contacted by Arturia to join their beta team for the Polybrute, and I helped to curate their analog accuracy controls for Arturia Polybrute's version 2 firmware. And then recently I also joined Groove Synthesis's beta team and helped them design and curate their vintage voice modeling algorithm on the third wave synth. And I've also had lots of conversations over the past years with various software and hardware developers about this topic. So yeah, I have a history and sort of a deep understanding of this vintage voice modeling topic, and this is one of the reasons why I was really interested in checking out what the Behringer UBXa did. So now let's discuss the UBXa's implementation of their atrophy profiles and their vintage voice modeling. I had really high hopes going into it that this was going to be sort of a cutting-edge, industry-leading implementation of vintage voice modeling, just because of the marketing materials that they released about the various vintage modes. and the release of the manual before the synth came out, I was reading up on it, and I was thinking that maybe they had taken some of the recommendations I had on the voice component modeling website for having various different sort of profiles of different synths, and implemented that on this synth. But unfortunately, my take on how they've built the Atrophy profiles, it's just not a great implementation. And I'll go into sort of the reasons why here. So first off, let's just talk about the general structure of how they've done it here. What they have here is if you hit Shift and you go to the Vintage button here, you have 8 different profiles here, which are 8 different sort of Atrophy models, I guess you would say. And each of these models has 40 individual settings associated with it. And you can access those deep settings by going Shift and clicking into Voice Atrophy Settings. And if you scroll through here, there's approximately 40 different settings right now. So the majority of these 40 or so settings that are saved per profile have nothing to do with per voice variances, which to me is really the key to vintage voice modeling. And that's, sort of the road that Sequential has taken, and Arturia and Groove Synthesis, as well as various other VST software manufacturers and other synth developers. So of those 40 settings, over half of them have nothing to do with per voice variances, but they actually globally change the way that the knobs and the value ranges operate for various parameters in the synth engine. So I know a lot of people have sort of mentioned that they're surprised at how much of a difference each of these 8 different Atrophy profiles has on the sound. And really the core reason for that is not that they are varying just the per voice variances and that sort of vintage variances, but they're massively changing the entire sound design of your patches when you switch between them. So if you dial in a great sounding patch and you spend a bunch of time, fine tuning all the resonance and frequency and getting the perfect timing on the envelopes and everything, and you've spent this time developing out a great sounding patch, when you switch to another Atrophy profile, you're not only switching up some of those per voice variances, but you are massively changing the entire sound design of what you've created. So all of a sudden, the frequency knob, it's basically the equivalence of turning the frequency knob here and turning the resonance knob here, maybe adjusting some of the attack, decay, and release, various other settings. So basically, if you switch the Atrophy profile and you want to have the same sound design that you had before, you have to go back and reset now the frequency back to where it should be and the resonance where it needs to be and all these other settings. So it's not a bad idea that they have access to varying the ranges and being able to say, okay, the frequency knob really only has a range from here to here or something when you go the full distance. It's fine if they want to have those settings. My recommendation would just be to have that be a completely separate menu, a separate sort of system from the vintage voice variances. To me, the vintage voice variances should just be that per voice variance from voice to voice, not stuff that's going to change the core sound design of your patches when you switch between profiles. So yeah, that's the first issue that I see with the way they've implemented the Atrophy settings. So the second issue with the Atrophy implementation is how they've implemented the per voice variances. So the methodology they're using for per voice variances is based on slop or drift, similar to like what Sequential did with their oscillator slop back 5 years ago, and what Behringer did also with their DeepMind, with their parameter drift and their oscillator drift algorithms on DeepMind, where you have basically LFOs that are randomly moving back and forth, and that's what's creating the per voice offsets. And the methodology that I've been advocating for and many manufacturers have been implementing is a different methodology, and that's based on having saved tables of data that provide stable curated offsets for all the parameters. So there's a few reasons why this is important for being accurate to how vintage synths actually perform. If you go in and record some old OBXs and OBXAs or any other vintage synths, and you record them voice by voice and parameter by parameter, you may find that voice 1, oscillator 1 is something like 6 cents sharp, and oscillator 2 on voice 1 is 3 cents sharp. And then on the next voice, you may find that oscillator 1 is perfectly in tune and oscillator 2 is 2 cents sharp, and so on and so forth. And these values are not swinging back and forth like an LFO motion or like a drifting motion. They're actually stable given the synth has warmed up and is not rapidly changing temperature. There is another phenomenon associated with oscillators called phase jitter, where you do have a little bit of back and forth, really quick motion, a sort of a high speed but extremely low, like maybe 1 cent of variance back and forth. That's sort of a different phenomenon than what I'm talking about for vintage voice variances, though, where you'll find that just in general, based on the calibration, each parameter will have a stable offset that will stay that way as long as you hold down a chord. It's not going to start drifting and changing and go from +6 cents and swing across to perfectly in tune and then to -6 cents, then back and forth like that. So the sort of motion that is used on this synth, this sort of slop or drift motion, is just a more artificial sound, and it doesn't accurately capture what classic vintage synths actually do. So in some patches, of course, it's less noticeable and you can get away with the sort of slop drift methodology. And of course, for many years with the, sequential synths and Behringer DeepMind and various other synths that have had that sort of slop functionality, it still is useful. It's just not the optimal sort of implementation for vintage voice modeling. So moving on to the next issue I see with the Atrophy settings is just that you can't save the Atrophy settings with the patch. They are globally saved, these 8 profiles with their 40 or so settings with the synth. And if you dial in a certain sound with the Atrophy settings, there's no way to save that and recall that next time you bring up the patch. If you're on a different Atrophy profile or don't recall what you were on when you designed the patch, you're going to have to sort of twiddle around and figure out how to get back your original sound design. This makes it also so you can't really share patches with other people, because if they've set their Atrophy settings differently, it could vary the sound design. If the settings in here alter how the knob varies the range of frequency or resonance or other characteristics, it just drastically changes the sound designs. And in addition, if you're just designing your own patches too, say you've spent a bunch of time and you've developed your first 20 patches on this synth and they sound great, and you like one of your profiles, and then you go to your 21st patch design and you're playing around with it and think, oh, this would be nice if it had more of that sort of vintage variances and more character. If you go in then on your 21st patch you've developed and go into the deep settings and dial up the vintage variances, this new patch you've developed is going to sound great, but now you've just altered every one of your previous patches as well, and they're all going to sound different now. So yeah, being able to save the vintage or Atrophy settings with the patches, I feel like that's sort of a key thing, and hopefully they can address that in firmware to make that part of the sysx packet for patch saving. And then the final thing I'll mention with the Atrophy settings is just, it would be nice if there was some sort of function like a shift button and dialing a knob where you could dial in the global amount of whatever Atrophy profile you're on, where you could dial it down to 0 and have no Atrophy settings, and then dial a single knob up to progressively dial up all of the settings in the Atrophy profile you're on, like the sequential vintage knob, or the controls on Polybrute or Third Wave, where you can easily sort of dial in a global amount of that vintage performance for whatever profile you have. So yeah, unfortunately, I went in with really high hopes for the UBXa that it was going to be sort of an industry-leading implementation of vintage mode Atrophy settings, but I am a little bit disappointed in it, honestly. So there is a workaround in that they have a mod matrix on this synth, and there are some voice mod sources. If you go Shift Mod, you go into the mod matrix, like on this patch, I've dialed in some here. So there's this one source called Spiral here, and then there's another one called Flip Left Right. So both of these two mod sources give you per voice variance to whatever destination you pick. So Flip Left Right, as far as I understand, is going to give you full negative modulation and positive modulation from one voice to the next for whatever modulation amount you dial up here. And then this Spiral one, this one progressively sort of gives you negative and positive offsets, is my interpretation of what it's doing here. And this one is useful, or a combination of those two per voice variances. You can route those to specific parameters, like here you see I've routed to filter decay here in mod matrix slot 1, and then this one goes to filter release, filter frequency, tuning, filter attack, and so on and so forth. So you can use the mod matrix slots to give stable offsets to various parameters, which is more preferable than having that random drifting motion that you get with the default algorithm for Atrophy. All right, so my final thoughts on this synth. I do have the Oberheim OBX8. When I put in my order for this synth, I was sort of thinking in the back of my head that maybe this synth would wow me and I would be moved to just sell my OBX8 and keep this less expensive synth. But yeah, overall, I don't see that happening. Just having that additional filter on the Oberheim is really nice. The SEM filter sounds just brilliant for the two-pole filter sounds. That's something that I definitely feel like I'd be missing on this synth. And again, I know they're creating a separate synth, the UBX, which will have that filter model. But yeah, that's just a big advantage that the OBX8 has, that it has both the OBX and the OBXA model, as well as the OB8 and the OBSX. So there's just a bit more versatility in those classic sounds in the Oberheim synth. Of course, this synth does have the 16 voices, and it does have the mod matrix as well, which is really nice. And that's one feature that I do prefer on this synth, and I wish my OBX8 had. From a general sound perspective, the OBX8 I do think sounds better overall. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this synth does have some issues with some popping sounds in certain cases, and I have had a little trouble getting the sort of resonant sounds that I want on this synth, whereas on the OBX8 I found that much easier to dial in. For the vintage voice variances, again, I'd say the OBX8 is the winner. Their vintage knob implementation is very good with stable curated offsets, tables of offsets to various parameters. This one I think just falls short as is, though maybe with some firmware updates, Behringer could update that. So yeah, I think that'll about do it for this video. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below or shoot me an email. Also, if you're interested in reading up more on the voice component modeling topic, check out my website at voicecomponentmodeling.com, and I have a lot more information on this site. If you found this video useful, please like and subscribe, and I hope you have a good one. All right, bye.